Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this spring include Meet the Moment, Fighting Anti-Semitism and Building a Just World, and Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. The JEDI plus JSSJ program is built around your busy schedule, driven by your individual professional development, and steeped in a rich culture rooted in justice. Learn more and apply now at usfca.edu/JEDI. Happy Hanukkah! This year, Judaism Unbound is partnering with our friends, the Torah Studio, in an initiative called ApocryFest, Hanukkah Unbound and Uncanonized. We believe that Hanukkah can be a time of year where we connect to many books that were not officially included in the Hebrew Bible, but which nonetheless can be meaningful for Jewish individuals, communities, and the world. Through 4 bonus episodes, we will be exploring some of these books in detail and asking big questions about what canon even means. Liana Wertman, founder of the Torah Studio, which is an accessible and inclusive learning space that encourages people to take ownership of our traditional Jewish texts, and to past partner with us on live streaming events exploring books from Esther to Lamentations to Ecclesiastes to Ruth, joins us for all 4 of these bonus conversations. Learn more and sign up for our ApocryFest email list, which will be sent out throughout Hanukkah, by visiting judaismunbound.com/apocrypha. That's APOCRYPHA. This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound. ApocryFest 2024-25, number 4, ApocryFest Now. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Liana Wertman.
And today, we've got bad news. It's bad news, it's also good news, but this is the final episode of ApocryFest 2024-25. We are now in the new year that is 2025, so Happy New Year to all of y'all out there that have entered it. If you haven't entered the new year, you have some kind of cool time traveling powers, and you should email us so that we can learn about that. But welcome to 2025. We are excited to close out this set of conversations, not by taking on like a specific book like we did in our previous 3. We looked at Judith, then Joseph and Asenath, then the letter of Aristeas, but rather by returning to our heartbeat, our nusach, our ongoing flow of ApocryFest year to year, which is what even is canon? What even is Apocrypha? What do we do with all this? So Liana, I'll let you start us off. Given that we just had a good time launching into a few new books of the Apocrypha, how should this actually affect the way we practice our Judaism today?
You said something in a past episode of this ApocryFest about maybe the reason that we're reading these stories as Apocrypha and not as canon is they like other people too much, right? Joseph and Asenath is too much about our relationships with non-Jews, that all of these stories are often really looking at Jews in a context outside of our own. And I agree. I think that one of the reasons books about us in relationship with other people end up in Apocrypha is probably because of when we canonized the Bible, when we canonized our stories, which was in a time of diaspora. And as a person who's reading them from a place of outside, from a place of diaspora, from a lens of Jews live around the world and have so many versions of Judaism, I love going back to stories where we were all kind of in more or less the same place, because I like that there's something we all have in common. And I feel sad with that question, because I think one of the things that I love about Torah is that even in Torah, we are almost never just by ourselves. We are usually in diaspora, right? All 5 books of Torah are in diaspora. We don't end up in a land together by the end. And we end the book still kind of in confusion. And we have books like Ruth, with Ruth and Naomi living in Moab and living in other places, which did make it into our canon. And books about living in Persia and living as Esther, as a queen of another place. And I'm just thinking a lot about how our later stories and now the stories we really do live in are so much reflections of questions like, what does it mean to be Jewish with people who aren't Jewish, with partners who aren't Jewish, with partners who become Jewish? And then I'm coming back to what we said at the beginning of our first Judith episode here this year, which is just part of the reason maybe they're not canon is because the people who were experiencing them were like, duh, this is just too much like life. We all know this. And there's this distinction that we get in Torah is actually on purpose, that it's the stuff that's the least recognizable that is the most shocking. And therefore, I'm just feeling really seen in a lot of these because I'm like, yeah, my life is also an apocryphal text of what it means to be Jewish outside of the biblical canon.
Weirdly, I'm flashing to an episode of the podcast we had with Melissa Clapper a while back. And she ended up giving like a really passionate call about the value of like teens' diaries in the 19th century. Turns out for historians, when they stumble on some random 9-year-old or 14-year-old's diary about their day-to-day life 100 or 500 years ago, that's actually of deep interest to them. Because the stuff that feels ordinary to us, just the everyday whatever of our lives, isn't always going to be precisely ordinary. There's also ways in which we're actually more interesting than we realize. And so I love what you're saying, that these stories give a window into things that may have just felt like obvious to the folks at the time, but we're lucky we have the stories nonetheless. The other thing I wanted to say, it's been kicking around in my head the whole time. We live in a specific moment, Jewish and broader history-wise, where the tendencies towards suspicion of our enemies, quote unquote, suspicion of those who are not Jewish, that's the tendency that gets the most centering in institutional Jewish life today. And the tendency towards actually trusting and hoping for connection to those that are deemed enemies is decentered in Jewish life. A lot of us are aware of that. A lot of us are wrestling with what that means for us and our relationship to our Jewish institutions today. But it's special and important that we can actually look to Jewish tradition and find examples of texts where suspicion of our enemies was not the purpose. I mean, Hanukkah, you talked about this. Maccabees is a book that is not super rah-rah. It's not a book that's all about how we can bridge build. The holiday of Hanukkah, as it's observed today in a lot of places, is all about how people hate us. People don't want us to be Jews. And we have surmounted the odds in a world of people who hate us to find ways to still live and be proud Jews. That's how Hanukkah is discussed. And there's truth to it. I'm not going to diminish that. There is also a side to that story that we don't tell, which is even in the time period of the Maccabees themselves, which is the time period of a lot of these books, there were huge contentious debates about whether and to what extent Judeans or Jews should be in deep relationship with those surrounding us. And there were lots of examples where it went very well. And we have examples like the letter of Aristeas, like Joseph and Asenath, like even the character of Achior in the book of Judith, where it is not the case that a default neighbor is one to be suspicious of, where we assume they're out to get us until otherwise. That feels really valuable this year especially, but every year, that we actually do come from a tradition. We are heirs to a set of texts that actually model what it is for Jews on an individual level, like romantically with Joseph and Asenath, and on a society level, like in Letter of Aristeas, to interact with our neighbors lovingly and not as enemies until proven innocent, but rather as potential partners until proven otherwise.
I looked this up after we recorded the episode on the letter of Aristeas, but the Septuagint and the letter of Aristeas were written around the same time as the Maccabees was not only happening, but being written, right? Like this is, and I think that it's important because Jews weren't just in one place. Jewish people were having experiences as Jews around the world already. I think we forget that even during the Second Temple period, Jews were living in diaspora, and they had been since the First Temple was destroyed. So they were already living in Egypt and in Greece, all over the world. And they were having different types of experiences because they were different groups of people, even though they had the same stories and the same texts. And I think that's also a big piece of it is we act like we all have one story, and it's hard for us to name a singular group story. And I think actually last episode, I talked about the idea that historians, right? A history book tells us more about the historian than it does about the time period that historian is writing about. And I wonder if the biblical canon tells us more about the time it was canonized than it does about the canon itself. And I think in that same way, right, we were looking for a particular story, and things like the letter of Aristeas and Maccabees next to each other are two honestly, the exact same groups of people having different experiences in different places. And once we have moved into full diaspora towards the beginning of the Second Temple, which is when we end our biblical canon, is really the first time that we can't make a claim of what a Jewish experience is, because they are living everywhere and in different ways.
Yeah, I just had a weird flash to that famous Monty Python thing where there's like a room full. This is like one of my favorite, I'm going to call it a Jewish text. It's like a film clip, so it's not a text, and it's also not Jews that made it. But there's that famous moment of, we're the Judean People's Front. And the person's like, oh, the People's Front of Judea? No. We hate the People's Front of Judea. We're the Judean People's Front. And like they go through the acronym soup of the slightly different, the front of the Judean people, or the People's Front of Judea. And all of those, if we, like, they are stories of Judeans, right? And exactly what you said, like, which one we tell on a holiday 1,000 or 2,000 years later is not a teaching about all of the Judeans of a couple thousand years ago. It's a teaching about what we are choosing to do today. And I would like to have agency in that. And we do have agency. Like, we think we don't. We think we are just sort of heirs to a tradition that is a certain way. And so Hanukkah is X. Hanukkah is the holiday that ties to the story of the Maccabees. Underscore, highlight the Maccabees. Not all the other Jews that were around during the Maccabees, including the ones, by the way, that the Maccabees were running around being violent towards. Maccabees were not only violent towards like Assyrian Greek Empire, they were violent towards Jews who did things ways they didn't like. But like, I want us to have the texts written by the Judean People's Front, and I want us to have the texts written by the People's Front of Judea. I want us to be engaged. Like, I'm a peoplehood guy, actually. I differentiate it from like a nationalism, but I want to be in relationship with the fullness of the Jewish people across all eras and geographies. I actually aspire to that in my day-to-day life. And from my perspective, anybody who claims that that is something they care about needs to be in relationship not only with the Jews that have been placed at the center of our story historically, like the Maccabees. They are, when you talk about Judaism, which is a weird anachronistic term 2,200 years ago, but when you talk about it 2,200 to 2,100 years ago, the main story, quote unquote, would be about that family, the Hasmoneans. There were plenty of other folks around with a lot of different agendas, with a lot of different interests. Some of them really wanted to rededicate that temple in Jerusalem. Others of them didn't care. Others of them were doing something else. I would like to be authentically, deeply in relationship with all of them. It's not that I'm going to be on the same page as all of them, but to create a connection that is trans-historic, that actually bonds us. You talked beautifully about how you want to be like in the same story with people. You like when these texts directly anchor in Torah, because it means that when we directly anchor in Torah, it's like a transitive property thing where group X related to Torah, group Y relates to Torah. Therefore, ergo, group X and group Y are related to one another. And so if I'm going to claim, and if others are going to claim, that we want to build connections to the fullness of the Jewish people wherever they live today and across history, then we should feel it's imperative, not just an option. It is imperative that wherever Jews have lived in history and whatever their agendas, we seek them out. Not to say all of them are equally correct, but because they're part of the story.
We call ourselves often the people of the book. And I like that we imagine that means like, no, we don't mean that we read the book. We just are owned by it, right? Like the book is not important.
That's so like people possessed by the book grammatically.
We're not possessed by the book. We're people who are a story people, right? One of the reasons that I think we still exist, because look at history. We shouldn't be a tribe from 3,000 years ago still really emotionally connecting to each other across time and space around diaspora as one people. But it's because we've all insisted for the last 3,000 years that the fact that we all root ourselves in Torah is enough that we're still family. We have the same story, and our family story is one. And also, like any good family story, if you put two family members in different rooms and ask them to tell that story, they'd tell completely different stories.
Unless they're the 72 scholars asked to write the text, because then they write the exact same story mythically.
Yeah, mythically, it's not at all, because they
don't actually.
months to travel to Egypt together, and we're like, let's impress this guy. We all got to have the same story. They got to like this story, because over back in Jerusalem, they're oppressing us. Maybe we can get them to stop, right? And I think when we read stuff like I said last week about Letter of Aristeas, last year about Letter of Aristeas, that we can also tell our own stories as stories. And I think that that's actually what I'm really excited by when you read Apocrypha, is there's this one set of stories that we all agree, really wild, didn't happen to any of us, therefore it happened to all of us. But it's also important that we look at the stuff that we do today, the stuff that is extensions of Torah, and not only believe that they're extensions of Torah in our hearts, but write them down and tell them as stories that are explicitly extensions of Torah, because they are, right? Our stories today don't have to be without God, and they don't even have to be, add some fun God in, right? Make it more magical, make it more legendary. Not because it's a lie, but because it's a better story. And it tells, a friend of mine just gave me the quote from a book about Jungian psychology on fairy tales, that fairy tales tell stories that are true on the inside, though they're not true on the outside. And I think that that's kind of the stories that we have to start learning how to tell, is the stories that are not necessarily true on the outside, but the ones that are true on the inside. We have to get a little less attached to the fact that they are historical or the fact that they are exactly what happened, because that's never the point.
Ooh, I love that fairy tale Torah. That's gorgeous. And the last thing I want to say, I mean, you mentioned last year. We recorded the Letter of Aristeas episode last year. That was just a couple days ago. I think that's the right note to end on. We have a new year that's happening right now. And if you talk to a lot of Jews, they would say, well, it's the secular New Year, or it's not the Jewish New Year. In the same way that they would say, well, the book of Judith, or the book Joseph and Asenath, the book Letter of Aristeas, they're books that connect to Jewish things, but they're not really the Jewish canon or the Jewish story. They're on the side. I hope that we can understand that the fact that this New Year is for Jews and everybody else doesn't mean that it's not a Jewish New Year, right? The fact that we don't know whether Joseph and Asenath was written with a Christian agenda, a Jewish agenda, something in between, something anachronistic that we can't quite describe in today's words. It's absolutely a story that connects to Torah directly, that can expand our own relationship to Torah and to our own Jewish selves. And it's kind of juicy and great. So I enjoy the New Year, secular or otherwise. I like it. I think it's fun to have a countdown where we turn the page, and somebody could tell me that it's less sacred than the Jewish one, which, by the way, Rosh Hashanah, if you go to the Torah, it's actually the 7th month. It's not the New Year, but we'll save that for another day. It's nice to have more prisms on what a New Year is, and we just encountered one of them. My hope is that having more prisms into what it means to be a Jewish story, what it means to be a Jewish text through these different examples has been meaningful for your Hanukkah and for your New Year, which this year do blend together. Most years Hanukkah is only on one calendar year. So I hope that this proves to have some kind of meaningful impact on your relationship to the world and to your own Judaism. So be in touch with us to let us know, like, hey, why didn't you talk about this Apocrypha book yet? I'm really into it. You should do that next year. Be in touch with us if you've done cool art related to any of these books. If you have questions, visions, ideas, whatever it is related to how ApocryFest could continue to ripple into the world. We've been overjoyed by the impact we've had. When we launched this a couple years ago, we thought 50 or 60 super nerds will sign up for the emails and that'll be it. No, we've had hundreds upon hundreds of people participating. So thanks to every one of you that is one of those. So let's continue building this, and let's make the reality where in 10 or 50 or 100 or 500 years, Hanukkah is not only a time to connect to a particular specific story of a particular specific set of Jews called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, but rather where it's a time to consider what it means to be part of a Jewish story generally. So we'll close there. Thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.